I'm getting pretty close to finishing up this sketchbook, and I've got a couple of blank pages here that I want to work on. On this first page, I'll be working on some quick sketches and thumbnails to figure out my scene. And on the page here to the right, I'll be doing the larger drawing once I figure out my direction. So with that, let's get to some sketching. So for my scene, I want to make a large structure as my main focal point. So this is basically going to be an environment design of some sort. So I'm thinking along the lines of some kind of fantasy world where we have a large structure, maybe it's a castle or some kind of monastery. And essentially, I just want to think about how I want to showcase this large area and the landscape around it. I like to keep the shapes as simple as possible so that way I can see my entire composition. This stage is very abstract, but for the most part, this is what we need in order to create a visually interesting design. At this stage, I haven't really figured out the exact direction in terms of what building to make. And I want to play around with the different camera angles and perspective, just so I can get a variety. When I do these thumbnails, I like to work as small as I can, but still make it clear enough for myself. And the reason I like to draw these small is so that I can see the larger composition, the larger design, and not get too bogged down with details. So a lot of these thumbnails here have the horizon line where it's fairly low within my frame. So I should probably try some variety where the horizon line is much higher, maybe somewhere up here. Perhaps the view is in the scene is where we're looking down at the subject. Now I know these might not look like fantasy or even medieval kind of buildings yet, but the main thing is I'm just trying to find a few different camera angles to get some variety on my composition. So after doing some of the thumbnails here where the horizon line is much higher, I think I'm liking the direction right now where the horizon line is much lower. So I think I'm going to go somewhere along this line. I'll do a couple more iterations here until I feel more confident with my overall composition. This is usually a time where I'll maybe pull some references as I need if I want to get a little bit more information with the drawings I'm doing. So I like the idea here where there are some floating structures, and I have this idea where the buildings is in ruin. I've recently been listening to the Stormlight Archive series by Brandon Sanderson, and there's some really cool worlds in his stories that, you know, really kind of filled up my imagination and been inspired to, and trying to come up with some designs for some of the places that are, you know, I'm imagining while listening to the audiobook. I also like the idea that there's some just like peaceful rolling hills and maybe some rocks, very little kind of trees and bushes. Now this is just a personal preference, but I like using pens to do some thumbnails and any quick sketches. And the reason for that is it forces me to be a little bit more deliberate with my design making choices versus, for example, using digital where I have the habit of hitting the undo button, or even pencil where I'll be finicky and trying to erase my marks. So those are, of course, great tools for maybe doing a longer drawing or a finishing piece. But when it comes to doing some quick sketches and iteration, the main goal is getting some good ideas. And with that, I like using a more permanent tool. So I'm not too worried about trying to make it perfect or too clean, but it's the idea that matters. But with the remaining space down here, I'm going to look up some references and do some quick studies on the type of structure that I may want to incorporate. So that way I can figure out the details and some of the scale references that I can use to make my scene a little bit more believable. So even though I am still drawing fairly loose, I'm drawing just a little bit slower to think about the details I want to work into my structure. And I'm just trying to use some repetitive elements. Some of it I'm seeing through multiple references, but then adding my own little shapes here and there to make my own design. And something that I can continue to repeat in the rest of the larger scene. And I'm mainly just looking at several medieval references, such as castles, walls, even doorways, things that I do want to put into my scene. On average, I do a few thumbnails here and there before I go to a final piece. Sometimes I'll do a dozen, sometimes I might even just do one. It really just depends on how clear the direction is for my piece In this instance, there were still a lot of things I needed to figure out, so I have a good amount of thumbnails here. Okay, so with that, I'm gonna grab my pencils so I can start to block it in lightly and add some more detail for a larger drawing. And I got one of my Blackwing pencils here because I just really like how smooth it is. So when I block this in, I wanna make sure that I get the overall shot and design from my thumbnail, as well as getting some of the main proportions that I drew in. As I block this in, I try to keep this as light as I can. So that way, when I make some changes, it'll be nice and easy. Just like many people, I'm also a big fan of things like Final Fantasy and other video games in that kind of genre. Those are definitely games that have influenced me and the type of art that I like to do. So in this piece, I have this large structure where perhaps some of the ruins are kind of floating around as if it's, kind of in a magical place where, gravity's not affecting it. And it just looks really cool visually as well. At this stage, I'm trying to get some detail with maybe some large corridors or even windows and towers into my structure. Just trying to add a little bit more relatable information for the audience so they can get a sense of the scale for the entire scene. Now that I've blocked in a good amount of information with graphite, I'm going to switch over to a pen so I can start inking some of the details, but I want to keep things fairly loose still, so that way I can maintain some of the gesture for this sketch. Now, even though I have a good amount of pencil in here, I'm not tracing over every single line when I'm inking. I still want to leave a good amount of detail that I can work in with the pen as well. So I'm kind of designing as I go along. I don't have everything figured out 100%, but that's okay. That's part of the fun when it comes to doing these type of sketches or any type of artwork, whether it's illustration, concept art, character design, you name it. This next part is probably the most fun in this process for me, but also the scariest because I'll be doing some ink washes with a brush, and a lot of things can go wrong, but what's really going to help is if I figure out the lighting for the scene that I'm going to do. So let's plan that out first. And for that, I'm just going to work on the thumbnail that's closest to my final scene. I'm going to start with a brush pen and ink out the darks that I want to stand out in the piece. So my initial idea is to have the light come from the right side, so the shadows will be a little bit darker on the left. Now I did add more elements that are not in the thumbnail in this, final piece, but the general shapes are there, the general composition. So whatever I do here will pretty much hold up on the final piece. Okay, to start off, I diluted the ink wash with some water, just to start off really light. And I'm thinking I want a dark sky in the background. So I'm gonna fill in the sky. And I think this is gonna help make a lot of the shapes here stand out. Okay, so for the most part, I'm pretty happy with how the lighting is planned out. So I'm gonna start working on the final sketch. I will still add some more detail here and there, but I'll do that later after the initial washes. And the reason I wanna save more of that detail to the very end is because if I have a high concentration of the textures and details, it will create a value that might affect the lighting. So that's something I wanna keep in mind when I'm finishing this up. So just like watercolor, you usually want to start as light as you can at first and then start to build up the values. So that's how I'm going to approach the ink wash here. The main thing about lighting is to keep the direction consistent, and that's what's going to help make things more believable. So everything that is on the right side here, I want to make sure it stays light, and everything on the left is getting a shadow. And just like what I've learned from watercolor, you gotta let some happy accidents happen. And a lot of times that's what helps make things look more painterly. It's also one of the key factors why a lot of times sketches look more lively than a final piece, is there's a lot of gestures and a lot more imperfections, that make it look a bit more interesting. Definitely mistakes will happen all the time, but with a traditional medium, especially with inks that are more permanent, one of those things that you have to practice is just continue moving forward, and they start making the sketch a lot more lively and energetic. So again, I kept things fairly light in the beginning, and then now that I'm feeling a lot more confident with my values, I'm going to start going darker as I continue finishing up this sketch. Even though I didn't outline everything, all the details, I'll still do some washes in the background just to make it look like there's atmospheric perspective. From here, it's also a good idea to take some small breaks, even stand up and just kind of look away from your overall piece. If you were using digital, for example, you would zoom out just to see your entire composition and also just to kind of see what's working and what isn't. But overall, I'm pretty happy with it so far. I feel like it's about 90% there. Just a few more details. After I let some of the ink dry up, I'll be able to assess the entire image. And then also I just want to add a little figure in here just for scale, just so we can see how kind of large this building is in this environment. So here there's a path along the bottom. And then perhaps we have an adventurer or maybe a couple people that are on their way to this ancient place. And they're basically just little stick figures, but it really helps with selling the scale to the viewer. I'm also going to add some smaller rocks and perhaps some indication of grass or some kind of foliage. And these smaller shapes will really help with the scale and also with the entire composition in terms of contrasting smaller shapes with the larger structure in the middle ground and background. When it comes to detail, it's always a balance of being able to see the entire composition and putting enough information in there for the viewer to understand what they're looking at. Like I mentioned earlier, I've been listening to a lot of the Stormlight archive books, and that's what I used as a source of inspiration for this image. So essentially, I'm pretty much done with this sketch, and overall, I'm pretty happy with it. It didn't become a complete disaster, especially when we started putting the ink wash. But yeah, so that's how I like to go about things when starting with some thumbnails to figure out the design, and then working with brush pens and ink wash to render it up. I hope you found some useful tips in here during this process, and I'll see you on the next one.